This is just a quick demonstration of painting a simple leaf. The leaf I've got here is a lilac leaf. It's quite big. It's probably, the actual leaf itself is about 8 centimetres long. And you can see it's got a few simple veins, but nothing too complicated. And it's a sort of mid to dark green. I've lit the leaf from the left, and it's not a shiny surface, it doesn't have a lot of highlights, but you can see shadows under the veins, and there's a bit of highlight area down here, and also just on this side here, and over at this edge where the leaf is curled up a bit. So I'm going to paint half the leaf at a time. Because it's quite big, I don't want to get the whole thing wet all at once. The paper might buckle. So I'm going to work first of all just on the right hand side of the leaf, and the first thing I'm going to do is just define the paler areas by adding a tiny bit of very, very pale blue. And this is really just to help me see my way around the leaf. So what I'm doing here is wetting the paper first of all. I prefer to work wet in wet, which means adding the paint to a damp paper. And I mixed up a very, very pale blue that I'm just going to put on in the highlight areas, just a little bit over here. I'm not too bothered about how neat that is because it's all going to get covered up around the edge by green that I put on later. Now I've let that dry, and then go on to start defining the shape of the leaf. So I'm going to wet the whole area. I've drawn on the veins in pencil as a guide, and I'm going to work over the whole thing, just keeping away from the veins. And I've got some green paint mixed ready, a reasonable colour match, but I'm going to alter that as I go. And I'll start with the top area and just let the paint flood over the surface. A little bit too wet there. See how it's making those sort of cauliflowery shapes. And I'll take my clean brush and just smooth that away. And there's a vein in here. My next segment continuous here, and it's a little bit darker at the above the vein. And I just want to smooth out those messy bits before the paint starts to dry. Returning now to the lilac leaf, I've let this dry overnight, and as you can see, it's still not dark enough. The colours are starting to be about right. A little bit more yellowy I think we need. I started to put in a few details around the shadows on the veins, and noticed that on the leaf itself, the central vein is a sort of pale greeny yellow, so I've put that in with the last wash of yellow. I've got too much contrast as yet on my leaf, but I'm keeping the highlights until the very end because it's easy to sort of lose them. And the right hand side of the leaf is in less relief, so I've got less highlights in my work over here. And at this stage the watercolour is still looking quite rough. I'm not bothered about that because I'm going to add a few more extra layers and that will cover it up and make it look much smoother. And once you're at this stage, you can work on quite large areas at a time, but it is important to let the paint dry in between. So what I'm doing now is just adjusting and modifying the colour. Building it needs to be darker. My painted leaf here looks quite shiny, but in reality the leaf is a sort of silky surface, quite matte, not shiny. The greens I want now are darker and more olivey. So here's one that I mixed up. It's dark, but it's not thick. I don't want to put thick heavy paint on. I'd rather build it up in layers, and I've mixed enough to cover the surface of the whole leaf. I'm going to go over the whole leaf in sections with this, and then I'm going to let it dry and vary the colour again. And because the paint is quite wet, I'm just going to go straight in. I'm going to effectively work wet and dry over the existing paint, and I've got in hand a damp paintbrush with clean water so that I can do any smoothing. So working on one side of the leaf at a time, and carefully observing the leaf itself as I go. I'm just going to add some paint in the darker areas. There's here and here, and as I go, just gently smoothing those edges. And I'm almost doing this as a sort of drawing directly from the leaf. I'm observing the leaf, the real leaf itself, very carefully as I add the extra layers of paint. I'm taking care around the highlights, and I don't lose them, but I don't want it to be too contrasty, otherwise the leaf looks shiny rather than silky. Put a little bit more in there. I can stand it, and because I'm going wet and dry, there's not a risk of the paint feathering or making cauliflowers. And if I'm getting too much dark, it looks like I've got too much dark in one place, I can just use my damp brush just to lift that paint off and just dab it up on a bit of tissue which is at the side, out with the view of the camera. Sorry about that. Little dark bit there that I missed. And then down here.
If we plant more apple trees, will we?
So just keeping going with the darker green. Avoid hard edges where I can. leaf, I'm noticing that it's getting a bit paler down towards the bottom edge, so I'm probably not going to put too much more paint on there. I just want to make that vein stand out a bit. And notice that I'm using the side as well as the tip of my brush. The side of the brush spreads the paint over a bigger area. Around here it looks as though I've got a bit of a fuzzy line, but that's actually deliberate. When I put on a pale greeny yellow wash to make the colour of the leaf brighter earlier on, I realised when I looked at the leaf it was paler at the edge and had a very dark line right around the edge, so I just extended the colour a tiny bit there and here with the pale green, and then when I come to finish the leaf I'll go around that with a dark edge, so it looks messy at the moment, but that is deliberate. And you can see here when the paint is wet everything looks brighter, so we're comparing the freshly painted wet side with the dry side, which I haven't painted since yesterday, and this looks a lot brighter because the paint is wet. That's just a feature of watercolour. You need to apply more and more layers until it stays bright, and that's just how the water and paint kind of settle into the paper. So now I'm going to go on to the second side of the leaf, and with this one I use a slightly bigger brush because there's not much highlight. I don't need to work between the veins in quite the same way. The veins are all dark, so I can use bigger strokes and more paint, and my paint film is going to cover more of the surface of the leaf. So I'm pulling it down here, but realising that there's some light bits there. So let's just smooth that out with a clean damp brush. And come in and add more paint up here. So what I'm seeing when I look at the leaf is it's paler in towards the central vein, so less paint on those areas. And then what's happening across over here, I'm quite dark, which I attempted to do earlier, but there's not enough layers of paint, so it looks quite dowdy. I've got a light area here, and what I've got on the painting is actually far too light, so I'm going to damp that, which will allow me to control the paint better and make it smaller by just dropping on some dark green around the edge and just letting it run out into the pre-dampened area. And then I don't even need to do very much extra work on there. Seems to have made quite a nice edge. And down here, just need to increase the colour. And again, we've got a sort of lighter green around the edge. And just smoothing with a clean damp brush. can see already the paint's starting to sink in and it's looking less of a bright colour, which means we're going to have to go back and add more and more. So at that point the paper is quite saturated, so I'm going to leave it to dry and come back to it later. If I was working on a big painting, I'll just move on to another leaf. So things to do next are to work on the detail of the central vein and the stem, to tidy up the edge around the whole leaf, and then just to keep darkening the colour. So I think it probably needs another 2 or 3 washes of green overall, and a bit more sort of flattening of these areas here so that they look sort of flat and silky rather than raised up and shiny. Nearly finished now with this leaf. I'm just going to put over some slightly darker green to pull the whole thing together, and as you can see, it's probably just how the leaf's starting to shrivel up, but there are some slightly brighter green areas here and here and here. So before I put over a wash on the whole lot, I'm just going to brighten those areas, and you can see that I've moved to a bigger brush now just so that I can work more quickly. So I damp the paint, and then I'm just going to drop in quite a bright green over here. I'm just now working very lightly at the side of my brush and letting the paint run over the surface of the paper. And I've got an even bigger brush here, damp with clean water, that I'm going to just use to soften there. And I might bring a little bit of this brighter green across here. And up along this edge, and also on that edge over there, and smooth. And I want to make my whole leaf a bit darker, so my next job is just to darken down here. That was just water, and then I've got a darker green mix that I'm putting over here. This one's not so bright. I don't want this to be a bright blue green, and I'm probably going to come back a couple of times with this, and again I'm just very gently blending those, and now I'm starting to let those highlight areas go because the leaf isn't very shiny and neither is it highly textured, so I can let that contrast fade away now in the final stages. Let's let that side of the leaf dry, and then over on this side I've got a bright area just where the light's catching it, so I'm going to put my brighter green just along here. It's quite thin. I don't want to add any thick paint at this stage because I've got the shape of the leaf already all in place. I'm just modifying the colours, making it a bit more interesting. The leaf itself is quite bluish here, so I'm going to leave those blue bits. And now I'm coming on to my darker olivey green, and it's darker than outside, so I'm dropping more paint and just smooth with this nice big brush. If the leaf dries like that, I'd be happy with it. Chances are it won't. It'll dry paler, and I'm going to have to come back and repeat this whole process a few times more. But at this stage, best thing to do is to leave it alone, give it a chance to dry, and see what happens. So I'll probably put this aside now until tomorrow, because the paper's quite wet.